It is the summer of 1940, and somewhere in a modest flat in Lisbon, a Spaniard is writing a letter. He has no diplomatic credentials, no official rank, and no employer that any government would openly acknowledge. What he does possess, however, is an extraordinary gift: the ability to construct human beings from thin air. On the pages before him, he is bringing to life a network of agents spread across Britain. A Welsh nationalist whose hatred of England eclipses any loyalty to the Allies, a Venezuelan student in Glasgow with communist sympathies, and a useful uncle in the merchant navy, a sub-agent stationed in Liverpool with connections to Scandinavian shipping firms. None of these people exist. Not a single one of them has ever drawn breath. The man writing the letter is Juan Pujol García. The year before, he had approached both British and American intelligence and been turned away. He had then done something quite remarkable. He had walked into a German consulate and offered his services to the Third Reich, convincing the Abwehr, German military intelligence, that he was a fanatical, pro-Nazi Spaniard willing to travel to Britain on their behalf. He had no intention of doing so. Instead, he travelled to Lisbon, bought a blue guide to England, a map of Britain, and a reference book on the British military, and began inventing an entire espionage apparatus from the comfort of a rented room. What followed was arguably the most audacious deception operation in the history of modern warfare. A one-man fiction that eventually grew into a British-run enterprise involving dozens of fabricated agents, thousands of false intelligence reports, and a lie so perfectly constructed that it helped determine the outcome of the Second World War. By the time British intelligence finally made contact with Pujol in early 1942, they were astonished to discover that the Germans were not only paying him handsomely for his invented reports, but treating him as their most valuable asset in Britain. He had been operating entirely alone, sustaining a fiction that MI5, the security service, had been unable to build in 2 years of wartime effort. They brought him to England, gave him the codename GARBO, and set about building the most sophisticated double-agent operation the world had seen. The challenge that existed before Pujol's arrival was not for want of trying. British intelligence had, since the early months of the war, been working to turn or neutralise every German agent operating in Britain. This project, the Double Cross system, formerly supervised by the 20 Committee, so named because 20 in Roman numerals resembles a double cross, had achieved some notable successes. But what the committee lacked was a German spy they wholly controlled, who also enjoyed the complete and unqualified trust of Berlin. Most turned agents were held at arm's length by their Abwehr handlers, useful for passing disinformation, but never fully embraced. Pujol was different. The Germans adored him. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, was itself a troubled institution. Nominally under Wilhelm Canaris, an admiral whose own loyalties were more complicated than the Reich was aware, the Abwehr competed constantly with Himmler's Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, for influence and resources. The Abwehr was not, by the standards of wartime intelligence agencies, a particularly efficient organisation. It relied heavily on agents recruited from neutral countries, men and women of divided loyalties and varying competence. Its vetting procedures were susceptible to exactly the kind of patient, methodical fiction that Pujol had been weaving since 1941. By the time MI5 and Britain's Secret Intelligence Service brought Pujol inside and began running him properly, they had a mechanism that exploited every weakness the Abwehr possessed. The operation that grew around GARBO was formally overseen by MI5 officer Thomas Harris, a half-Spanish art dealer whose combination of linguistic fluency and psychological acuity made him the ideal handler. Harris and Pujol together composed GARBO's reports in a language of such elaborate bureaucratic precision that German handlers in Madrid found them irresistible. Over the following 2 years, the network expanded on paper to include 27 fictional sub-agents spread across the British Isles. There was the network in the Midlands, the wireless operator in Swansea, the contact in the Ministry of Information. There was even a fictional brother-in-law of dubious reliability introduced to account for information the Germans might receive from other sources. The sheer volume of material generated was staggering. By some estimates, GARBO sent over 3,000 intelligence reports across the course of the operation. Many contained genuine information, carefully selected for its low value or its already outdated relevance. Others were constructed from publicly available sources newspapers, train timetables, advertisements. Combined with the kind of plausible operational detail that Harris and Pujol had become expert at inventing, the reports arrived in Madrid by letter, by courier, and eventually by wireless, each carrying the voice of a man the Abwehr believed to be their finest agent in enemy territory. The physical logistics of sustaining the fiction required considerable ingenuity. Pujol's subagents needed to be located plausibly, in ports, in industrial centres, near military installations, and their reports needed to reflect the geography they were meant to inhabit. Harris and Pujol used ordnance survey maps, railway guides, and hours of meticulous research to ensure that every detail remained internally consistent. When a fictional agent in Liverpool was unable to report on shipping movements, a plausible reason had to be invented. When a Glasgow subagent fell ill, the illness needed to follow a realistic progression. The internal correspondence of the GARBO network, written entirely by two men in a house in Jermyn Street, ran to hundreds of pages. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Managing the Germans' expectations required an equally delicate touch. The Abwehr was not composed entirely of credulous men, and there were moments throughout the operation when sceptical handlers in Madrid pressed for verifiable details that might expose the fiction. On at least one occasion, Pujol was forced to report the death of a sub-agent, a Welsh nationalist operating under the name Benedict, after the Germans requested a meeting with him that could not practically be refused. The death was staged with characteristic thoroughness, down to a forged obituary, and a period of mourning that Pujol described in his reports with affecting sincerity. The Germans, it seems, were genuinely moved. Where GARBO differed from every comparable operation of the war was in the scale of the strategic deception it would ultimately serve. Double-cross agents had been used throughout the conflict to pass disinformation on troop movements, order of battle, and operational intentions, but nothing previously attempted matched the ambition of what was planned for the spring and summer of 1944. Operation Fortitude, the deception plan designed to conceal the true destination of the Allied landings, depended entirely on convincing Germany that the Normandy landings, when they came, were a feint. The real invasion, Fortitude was designed to suggest, would fall at the Pas de Calais, where the channel is narrowest and the obvious logic of military geography seemed to dictate. To sustain this belief, the Allies needed the Germans to hold the powerful 15th Army in reserve north of the Seine, rather than committing it to repel the Normandy bridgehead in its critical early days. The margin of success or failure might be measured in hours. GARBO was central to this plan. In the weeks and months before D-Day, the network was used to build an elaborate picture of a fictional army group. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, nominally under the command of General George Patton, massed in southeastern England and poised to strike across the short sea crossing to the Pas de Calais. Physical deception, inflatable tanks and lorries, dummy landing craft on the Thames and its tributaries, phantom wireless traffic generated by actual signals units, reinforced what GARBO was telling Berlin. The Germans, already inclined to believe that any invasion commander would prefer the shortest route, found the fiction entirely persuasive. On the night of June 5th, 1944, GARBO sent a message to his Madrid handler warning of imminent landings in Normandy. The message arrived too late to be useful. Whether by design or by the practical difficulties of obtaining a wireless operator at that precise hour remains a matter of some historical debate. What followed the landings, however, was the crucial test. On June 9th, 3 days after the Normandy beaches had been taken, GARBO sent the message that may have decided the campaign. He told Berlin that the Normandy operation was a diversionary attack, that the main force remained in southeastern England, and that the true objective was still the Pas de Calais. He was so convincing, and his reputation with the Abwehr so high, that Hitler personally intervened to hold the 15th Army in reserve, a decision that denied the Wehrmacht its best chance of throwing the Allied forces back into the sea. The German failure to compare notes between their various intelligence services contributed materially to the deception's success. The Abwehr and the SD, locked in institutional rivalry, were reluctant to share assessments. Both were receiving information from their own networks, all of which had, by mid-war, been turned or neutralised by British intelligence. And neither was in a position to realise that the entire edifice of their British intelligence was a construction. The 20 Committee had, by this point, achieved something remarkable. They had replaced Germany's real picture of Britain with an invented one, and the Germans had no means of knowing it. The comparison with German deception operations reveals the asymmetry starkly. The Abwehr's Rulermann attempted to establish networks in Britain using agents dropped by parachute or landed by submarine. Almost everyone was captured within hours of arrival. The Germans sent over approximately 115 agents to Britain during the course of the war. Every single one was caught. 14 were executed. Many of the remainder were turned and used as instruments of British deception. The Germans, for their part, never succeeded in placing a single controlled agent in Britain who was not known to the security service. The structural advantages they possessed, shorter communications lines to neutral countries, a network in Ireland that might have served as a staging post, were never exploited with anything approaching the systematic intelligence that the British brought to the problem. The Americans, by contrast, ran their own equivalent operation, the XX Committee's American offshoot, with considerable energy, though their operations rarely achieved the elegance of GARBO. The Office of Strategic Services, established in 1942 under William Donovan, was still learning the mechanics of strategic deception in the period when GARBO was at the height of his influence. American double agents operated more often in the Mediterranean theatre, where the terrain of disinformation was different, and the stakes, while real, lacked the singular clarity of the D-Day operation. The actual impact of GARBO on the outcome of the Normandy campaign is one of those historical questions that can be assessed but never definitively resolved. The historian's tools, the ultra-signals intelligence that allowed British analysts to read Abwehr communications, the captured German operational records, the post-war interrogations of surviving Wehrmacht officers, all point in the same direction. The 15th Army remained north of the Seine for weeks after D-Day. By the time it was clear that no second invasion was coming, the Normandy bridgehead was secure, reinforced, and beginning the breakout that would carry Allied forces across France within weeks. The counterfactual, the 15th Army committed to the Normandy beaches on June 7th, 3 days after the landings, is not a pleasant one to contemplate. GARBO was awarded the MBE by the British, and, with almost unimprovable irony, the Iron Cross by the Germans, the only person known to have received both decorations during the Second World War. He later faked his own death in Angola in 1959 and lived for decades in Venezuela before being rediscovered by British historian Nigel West in 1984. He died in 1988, having been brought back to Britain to meet the Duke of Edinburgh and attend ceremonies commemorating D-Day. Thomas Harris died in a car accident in Spain in 1964, his contribution to the war effort still largely unknown to the public. The original Abwehr files pertaining to the GARBO operation were partially recovered after the war and are held, in various states of completeness, in archives in Britain and Germany. Pujol's own account of the operation, co-written with Nigel West, was published as GARBO in 1985. The files of the 20 Committee are held at the National Archives in Kew, where researchers can consult the extraordinary paper, Architecture of an Operation that, for 3 years, maintained a population that did not exist and made Germany believe in a Britain it had never seen. What Pujol achieved, stripped of its bureaucratic complexity, was the manufacture of reality. 27 human beings, summoned from a blue guide and a fevered intelligence, wrote letters and filed reports and fell ill and died and worked their tedious fictional jobs in Liverpool and Glasgow and Swansea. They were paid, they had grievances. One of them, according to his files, had to be bribed to keep quiet. Another developed an inconvenient enthusiasm for the wrong politics. They were, in every respect except existence itself, alive. Germany fought the Second World War, in part against a country populated by people who had never been born. They funded them, trusted them, rewarded their handler with the highest military honour they possessed, and held their best army in reserve, on the word of men and women who had never taken a single breath. The beach at Normandy held. The bridgehead survived. The breakout began, and somewhere at the root of all of it was a man in a Lisbon flat with a blue guide and an idea so absurd, so completely implausible, that it could only ever have worked because no one who mattered ever quite believed it possible. Juan Pujol García, the man who defeated the Wehrmacht with 27 people he invented, did not exist. Neither for 3 extraordinary years did Germany's picture of Britain, and that, more than any weapon or strategy or act of battlefield courage, is what kept the Allies on the beach long enough to win.